One of the pieces of advice that I was given very early on in my career by another rabbi was that after you write your sermon, you have to give your sermon a title. And if you can't give that sermon a title, it's not likely that your congregants will be able to give it a title either and know what it's about. Over the years, I've given at least 2 sermons with the same title, and now this is going to be the third. The title is The Hardest Words to Say. What are the hardest words to say? So the first time I gave this sermon, I think it was either in New Jersey or maybe very early on when I was here, the hardest words to say were I wrote, "I'm sorry." And that's true, especially when you've wronged another person. Everyone here knows that sometimes saying "I'm sorry" can divide families, or not being able to say "I'm sorry" forever. And people really struggle to say that. I gave the sermon a second time. I was definitely here for that one. And in that one, I said that the hardest words to say were goodbye or farewell. My wife tells me this is especially true when you are Jewish. Non-Jews leave without saying goodbye. Jews say goodbye and never seem to leave. Especially at Kiddush on Shabbos. Only recently I have concluded, and this third time is of course the charm, because every third time is a charm, that there are 3 very hard words to say, and those are perhaps the 3 hardest words to say in the entire Jewish religion. And those are the words Baruch, Dayan, Emet, which means blessed is God, the judge of truth. The Mishnah teaches us that whenever we hear bad news as a Jew, we say the words Baruch, Dayan, Emet. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, who is the judge of truth. Yet tachlis, practically speaking, we don't usually say these words that often when we hear bad news. They are usually recited at the graveside at a funeral, precisely at the moment when you as a person are at your most vulnerable. Which is why I say these are the hardest words to say. How, after all, can we say, Baruch Dayan Emet, blessed is God, the judge of truth, precisely at the moment when the truth is what is right in front of you, is very hard to accept. Right at the moment when you're about to rip an article of clothing, rip a ribbon, which is a physical manifestation of the ripping and the tearing of your soul inside, we are told that we must accept the judgment as true. And there's an additional dimension to this too. For most of us, praising the judge of truth means not only that we have accepted the verdict, but the verdict was issued justly. And I don't need to tell you that sometimes as human beings, we don't always believe that the verdict was issued correctly. Perhaps when you attend the funeral of someone like my great-grandmother who lived until she was 102 years old and had dementia, okay, you can say, Baruch Dayan Emet. I accept the verdict of what has happened. But can we say Baruch Dayan Emet when a 17-year-old kid drops dead on a football field? What truth is there when someone is taken by a particularly cruel disease with months or even years of pain and suffering? How do we affirm the trueness or justness of God's judgment when the truth seems cruel, painful, and atypical of our human view of truth? In our parsha this week, we read a verse that encapsulates what I believe to be the divine theology around justice, or how God makes decisions. Hatzor Tamim Poalo, there is a rock, we read, whose deeds are perfect, a God whose ways are just, a faithful God, El Emunah Ve'ein Avel, who is never false, true and upright indeed. Reflecting on these words, it seems to me that there are two conclusions we can draw about divine justice as far as we human beings seek to understand it. First, the parasha affirms from us that God makes decisions that are always grounded in truth and justice. And therefore, second, we have to understand that there are times in our lives where we are not privy to the details of the verdict, where there are times in our lives where we do not understand God's decision. But just because we are not privy to those details, just because we don't care for the result, does not mean that the verdict was not carried out with any less truth and justice. I want to acknowledge this is not a theology that many of us as Jews are comfortable with, especially when it comes to things that we cannot understand in our lives. You may not know this, but the name Dorsh means seeker of truth. It also means to be very demanding. That makes all of us Dorshes from time to time. For an act to be true or just, we as human beings demand transparency from God. We want to know why it happened the way it happens. When I was a kid, I remember getting a great book from my parents. I'm sure some of you as parents got this for your kids too. It's called The Way Things Work by David McCullough. You know, I remember the first chapter, it was about lasers, okay? I knew there was a laser in Star Wars, but that was about as much as I knew at the time. Lasers seemed very ethereal to me as a kid. They didn't seem real. Then in chapter 1 of that book, or chapter 2, I read about how lasers worked. And all of a sudden, those lasers became very real to me. They became true to me in my limited universe. It's the same truth-seeking tendency that I think motivates parents of children to do and stress what we are called logical consequences. Anybody do logical consequences with their kids? Anybody do illogical consequences with their kids? You know, kids don't like to be said, why? Because I told you so. Go to your room. Why? Because you were bad. Yet if your child doesn't do their homework, and I speak here from no personal experience at all, you can take away their iPad time. Why? Because you didn't use your time well for what you were supposed to, and so you can't use it for something else. That is the way that human beings understand truth and justice in the world. Unfortunately, we live in a world right now where not everything happens according to that logic. And that's why there are a great many people of many faiths who love to use the expression, everything happens for a reason. That is Parashat Ha'azinu that we read this morning. And for some folks, believe it or not, that theology is very comforting. It affirms for us that there are some things in life that are beyond our understanding, things that we cannot control. And it reminds us, by the way, that two things can exist simultaneously. We can both be angry and have trouble accepting something, while also acknowledging there is a sense of truth and justice in the world that we don't always understand. A story is told about the Chafetz Chaim, who once asked a friend, "How are things with you?" The friend said, "You know Chafetz Chaim?" He probably didn't say Chafetz Chaim, he said whatever his name was. "It wouldn't hurt if things were better." It wouldn't hurt if things were better. What do you think the Chafetz Chaim said? And how do you know it wouldn't hurt if things were better? God is merciful and knows how to do with God's creatures, he said. And so perhaps if God hasn't made things better for you, this might be what is an indication of the way things should be. How do we as human beings live with these two seemingly contradictory ideas? On the one hand, it seems that we sometimes have an unjust world, And yet there is Parashat Ha'azinu. There is divine justice on the other hand. Is there divine truth in the world? Nachmanides Ramban writes in his commentary that when it comes to understanding this verse, Hatzor ta'amim pa'olo, that God is a rock and there is divine truth, there is only one answer. Go study Kabbalah. Why does he say this? Two possible reasons, in my view. Perhaps he too was bothered by this seemingly incongruous way that we view justice in the world. And God also views truth in the world. And maybe for Nachmanides, studying Jewish mysticism was the answer. But it could also be because he believed that there was a deeper mystery to the way God works. A greater mystery to the idea that things happen for a reason that we do not, as human beings, understand. It is because of this conflict, our belief, or so we are told in the Torah, that God is just, while also encountering a world and a reality that is full of injustice, that this Shabbat Ha'azinu, I want to argue, perhaps once and for all, what the three hardest words are to say in the world. Baruch Dayan Emetz. Blessed is a God of truth and justice when we see so much injustice in the world. God in our parasha is the rock, perfect and just. And yet we also can acknowledge in our moments of greatest suffering that we don't see the world that way. It may also be hard because so many of us may not even accept the premise of God being just in the world. As for me, as we ponder this dilemma further, you know what I'm going to go do? I'm going to go study Kabbalah. Shabbat Shalom.